A gigantic US aircraft carrier lurking just off the coast.
A new US aircraft carrier is moving into the Caribbean.
Check. The targeting of senior government officials.
President Trump imposing sanctions on the island's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel.
Check. And the president making threats to invade.
Cuba's next, by the way, but pretend I didn't say that.
Check. In the last few weeks, we've seen the Trump administration turn up the heat on Cuba, and the playbook might feel familiar. We saw similar preemptive actions from the US before it attacked Venezuela, then Iran. So, while politicians in Washington and Miami talk about a friendly takeover, could the US actually be planning an invasion of Cuba? And with millions of Cubans facing blackouts and shortages after a strict US oil embargo, what might Donald Trump have planned for the country if he's able to topple the regime? Here's what you need to know. Trump and those closest to him claim that Cuba poses a massive threat to the US.
Look, it's a failed country. Everybody knows it.
Cuba has always posed a national security threat to the United States.
Other presidents have looked at this for 50, 60 years. It looks like I'll be the one that does it.
These tensions between the US and this Caribbean island state go back decades. They have their roots in the ideological battle between communism and capitalism that played out during the Cold War. Since Fidel Castro and his band of revolutionaries seized power in 1959, Washington has been trying to topple the communist regime. Every attempt has failed. For decades, successive US governments have relied on economic sanctions, imposing an embargo that has been in place for almost 70 years.
The best way to understand the economic survival of Cuba is to understand it politically. Between 1960 and 1992, it was very utterly dependent on trade with the Soviet bloc. It relies on other countries. It has relied always on Venezuela for its oil, and it's not getting any. That really ended in January.
That's when the US pulled off the audacious capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The fact that 32 Cuban officers working for Maduro were killed during that operation shows just how close Venezuela-Cuba relations were. And the severing of those vital oil supplies from Venezuela has left the Cuban regime in a vulnerable position. Of course, there's still a political calculation for Donald Trump to make. While the capture of Maduro showcased the power and reach of the US military, things haven't gone quite so well in the Middle East. Powerful airstrikes removed Iran's supreme leader, but the full-blown regime change Trump craved there now looks practically impossible. And the global economy has suffered badly from Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz. With no resolution in sight, a quick military victory closer to home in Cuba could distract from that debacle and restore some pride.
I think on the one hand they're buoyed up by what is possible through Venezuela, and on the other hand I think they feel like they need a foreign policy success, and the next foreign policy success they're looking for, Trump's legacy, is knocking over the communist regime here in Cuba.
So what are Trump's options? One possibility is a repeat of what we saw in Venezuela, a so-called decapitation strike, where the US might look to capture one of Cuba's leading figures. But that kind of operation would be risky. Any element of surprise has been taken away. The US seizure of a foreign leader would have seemed shocking in January, now perhaps not so much.
You were not going to see some kind of extraction or dramatic, spectacular wave of bombs. I think that would be stupid. Cuba has a very large population of interested parties in South Florida, and they have a lot of money, and they want as much as possible for Cuba to its integrity and its infrastructure to be theirs.
Cuba's president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, has said the country is ready to face serious threats and military aggression. More recently, former Cuban leader Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, was charged by the US with murder, accused of involvement in shooting down 2 planes carrying Cuban Americans in 1996. He's still a hugely influential figure in Cuba. Experts say this legal pressure is timely.
We have congressional representation in South Florida that has been calling for military intervention since January. So it's been too long for them, and the Trump administration had to hand the Cuban exile elite a kind of gift, which is the promise that Raul Castro, if he is brought to the United States, would be tried. And that spectacle that we saw when the indictment was produced was highly orchestrated.
Another option is for the US to launch an attack on Cuba's military with the aim of forcing regime change by destroying its capacity to fight or by causing a popular uprising. That's similar to its strategy in Iran. So far, Trump has been dancing around whether there will be military strikes on Cuba.
All my life I've been hearing about the United States and Cuba. When will the United States do it? I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba.
So could a major attack still be a possibility? The US military recently celebrated the arrival of the USS Nimitz aircraft carrier and accompanying warships in the Caribbean. On the same day, charges against Castro were announced. It's not quite the naval build-up we saw before the operation in Venezuela, but it's still significant. US military analysts told us an invasion is unlikely, as while Cuba's military has deteriorated significantly, its ground forces and militia are still strong. Around 100,000 US troops would be needed to invade and occupy. That would be a huge commitment. A blockade, we've been told, would be far more effective. And of course, the US is already applying added economic pressure. Strangling Cuba's economy further through a blockade could be a way for the US to force an agreement without overt military action. The US has operated a semi-blockade on oil since January, which has worsened a prolonged economic crisis, resulting in crumbling public services, water shortages, and energy blackouts.
Donald Trump's government is trying to lean on Cuba's traditional allies and pressure them into stopping sending crucial supplies like oil to prop up this government. Already the oil supply from Venezuela has been cut off. The second biggest supplier was Mexico. Last year they supplied 44% of Cuba's oil. The result has been a really dire constriction of the oil supply here, and that's seen everywhere you go with the lack of vehicles on the streets. The price of oil on the black market now has reached about $7 a litre. And when you bear in mind that the average wage here can be as little as $20 or $30 a month, you can see that really for most ordinary Cubans, filling up their vehicles is becoming increasingly impossible.
So what could the outcome of all this be? Well, Donald Trump has a name for his perfect scenario.
A friendly takeover?
This would likely involve the US identifying friendly figures within the Cuban government who would be willing to cut a deal and undermine the communist regime. It's an approach that seems to have paid off in Venezuela, with the installation of the more pliant Delcy Rodriguez in place of Maduro. The ultimate goal for the US would be a puppet government that opens the Cuban economy to US investment. But would it work?
It would be a massive undertaking to take responsibility and actually provide the relief and then the rebuilding and the reconstruction of Cuba. And when I say that, I refer to the hospitals, to the roads, to the streets. I mean, anybody who's been to Havana or to the cities knows that, any residential area where tourists tend to not go, you have holes in the streets that aren't even potholes anymore. They're like craters.
In a worst-case scenario, an intervention by the US could lead to Cuba's government digging in their heels and tightening their grip on the economy, military, and the lives of everyday people. Back in February, the UN warned that the country faced a humanitarian collapse if blockades continued. That was 4 months ago, and the situation is getting worse by the day. Donald Trump was re-elected, promising an end to so-called forever wars and foreign intervention. But the man who once described himself as the president of peace has spent a great deal of time and money interfering in the affairs of other countries. With this most unpredictable of presidents, it's impossible to know how these threats against Cuba will actually play out.